This is a topic that we need to discuss because there are so many people that aren't really even sure what consciousness is, and this leads to a lot of confusion. And specifically what we're going to be talking about is metacognition. And in order to reach a higher state of consciousness, which is of course what we want to bring to the world, the tools for humanity to do that so that they may reach the next level, you can't do that without an understanding of metacognition. Metacognition is absolutely 100% crucial to understanding how to reach the next level of consciousness, how to reach the next level of evolution. It's sort of the key to everything. It's an extremely important element. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. What is consciousness, first of all? And we're going to be talking about metacognition. What is metacognition? And then ways of implementing metacognition within the Hyperion framework. So when we're talking about metacognition, the first thing we have to do is give a little description of consciousness, because metacognition is all about consciousness and raising one's consciousness. And to be able to do that, we have to have a firm understanding of what consciousness is. And unfortunately, consciousness is an extremely misunderstood thing. And one of the reasons why it is so misunderstood is because it is extremely poorly defined. And depending on what field you are investigating, they will define it in a different way. For example, a psychologist, a doctor, and a philosopher may all define consciousness in a completely different way. So sort of everyone has a different, and then within those fields, depending on the, different sect or whatnot, within those fields themselves will define consciousness differently. So consciousness can be a very, very tricky subject because there is not a consensus on its definition. So let's talk about it right now and kind of nail down a definition. When we talk about consciousness in Hyperionism, we mean explicit consciousness, meaning explicit self-awareness. Okay, so in Hyperionism, unless otherwise stated, when we say consciousness, we're talking about self-awareness. Now, if you talk to a New Ager, or you talk to a philosopher, or you talk to a psychologist, or you talk to a philosopher, they may or may not have that definition. Some people just kind of talk about consciousness as being mind in a very general way. Some people do. Whereas others, it's a field of experience. And you have these, different definitions. Now, just to be clear, so we're all on the same page, when we talk about consciousness, we're talking about explicit self-awareness. So that's very important for what we're going to be discussing. But let's nail down a few more terms, okay? We also want to, so basically the 4 terms that I want to define here before we can really dive into metacognition is sentience, the unconscious, the preconscious, and consciousness, okay? So first of all, sentience. Again, a lot of people confuse sentience with consciousness. Sentience is just the ability to experience qualia. Now, what is qualia? Qualia is just a subjective experience, like the taste of watermelon, or the prick of a needle, or the experience of the color blue. Qualia, they're subjective experience. Okay? So an animal is sentient. They can taste things, they can smell things, and there's a subjective experience that goes along with all these different things. They taste, they smell, they see, they hear, most of them do. And that is sentience. A rock is not sentient. A rock doesn't feel pain when it's struck. An animal does. So an animal is sentient. Now notice that this does not involve consciousness, with consciousness being defined as self-awareness. So you don't have to be self-aware to be sentient. Sentience is just the ability to have subjective experience. You don't have to be self-aware to have subjective experience. So not all sentient creatures are conscious self/self-aware. But now, so that's an important thing to remember, okay? Because first of all, a lot of people think sentience is consciousness. It is not. Sentience is the ability to experience qualia, which is just subjective experience in general. Qualitative subjective experience. Now we have the unconscious, and the unconscious is just your mental receptacle. So your consciousness, your self-awareness is everything that you're explicitly aware of right now. So you're sitting here and you're consciously aware of me talking to you. So I am within your field of consciousness. You are conscious of me. And now everything that you are consciously aware of, that's your consciousness. Your unconscious is all of the parts within your mind that are there and exist but are very, very real, but you don't have conscious access to them. So this can be like repressed, traumatic experiences. It can be just certain things that your mind has deemed not worth bringing into consciousness. Your unconscious is the deepest, most vast part of your mind. It contains all the different archetypal programs, shadow self, mirror self, power self. Your unconscious is very vast and deep, and it contains all the parts of you, your mind, that you are unaware of, but are very, very real. Now, the preconscious is sort of that. It's not quite conscious, but not quite unconscious. It's sort of like things that you could easily retrieve. A memory that you're not perhaps thinking about right now, but if you wanted to, you could easily retrieve it. Or let's say that you have an itch on your leg, but you're not conscious of it right now, but then you direct your attention towards it, and then you sort of notice it. It's not a really great example, but it kind of gives you a flavor of what I'm talking about. There's different things that you could easily pull up into consciousness if you wanted to, but aren't doing so explicitly. Okay? So, really important. We're going to now move into understanding metacognition, but it's really, hopefully now you guys understand the importance to understanding now that consciousness is explicit self-awareness. Okay? It's explicit self-awareness, and we have all these other different aspects that are very important. And creatures such as animals are sentient, but they are not self-aware. For the most part, of course. Now, of course, there are some animals that do pass the mirror test. And so some animals do have a bit of consciousness, a bit of self-awareness. But I'm being very general here. So just keep in mind, there's always exceptions, and ultimately consciousness is a sliding scale. It's on this spectrum. So you are going to find some animals, very, very rare, but some animals that are sort of starting to just, start to develop a form of self-consciousness, self-awareness. And I don't particularly think that the mirror test is the best test in the world for confirming or denying this. I think it's very primitive, but it is an indication. So now that we've defined sentience, unconscious, preconscious, and consciousness, let's start to talk about metacognition. And real quick, I want to also keep in mind that self-awareness requires the development of the ego. Okay, but we're gonna explore that as we talk about metacognition. So what is metacognition? Well, the first thing we have to do is understand what meta is. Meta is, let's use an example for meta. Meta always involves self-reference of some kind. So, for example, a photographer that takes a picture of someone taking a picture, we would say that's meta. Or a painter that paints a painting about a painter painting a painting, that's meta. Or a reviewer that reviews reviewers like a movie reviewer, a reviewer that reviews movie reviewers, we would say that's meta. So meta always involves self-reference. So what is metacognition? Metacognition is self-referential thought, which means thinking about thinking. That's what it is. That's what metacognition is. Thinking about thinking. But you might think, well, that's very simple. But the thing to understand is that hardly anyone thinks about thinking. You might be thinking, what do you mean? Everyone thinks about thinking. No. Many people think. Hardly anyone thinks about thinking. People think, I am going to go to the store today. That's not thinking about thinking. People think, I'm going to pray to my God today. That's not thinking about thinking. People might even think, oh, I'm going to do a scientific experiment today. Again, that's not thinking about thinking. That's thinking about what you're going to do today. That's thinking about faith in a deity. That's thinking about gathering empirical data. That is not thinking about thinking. What thinking about thinking means is to analyze the very structure of thought itself. And metacognition, there's varying degrees of this. And increasing your ability to have metacognition is what will develop your ability to reach a higher consciousness. So in order to reach a higher level of consciousness, you need to have reason, and you need to have metacognition. And this can be developed because, like I said, the vast majority of humanity, they don't engage in any kind of thinking about thinking. They just think. They don't think about thinking. It's like I say, when you go to school, they don't teach you how to think, they teach you what to think. And that's terrible. Our schools should be all about metacognition, but they're not. They're not at all about metacognition. And so self-awareness itself is a very early stage of sort of metacognition. Okay, it's not thinking about thinking. Okay, self-awareness isn't thinking about thinking, but it involves self-reference. Because when humanity is unconscious, they just are instinctual or bicameral. They go about their business doing whatever it is that they do. They don't have a form of self-awareness. Now, when self-awareness started developing in humanity, that involves self-reference. The ego is a development of self-reference. You have to have an ego to begin to have a consciousness. You need to develop an ego is the center of your field of consciousness. That's what an ego is. It's very important. We do not want to destroy the ego like BS New Ageism teaches. We do not want to destroy the ego. We want to strengthen the ego because the ego is the center of your field of consciousness. And to reach higher levels of consciousness, it means strengthening your ego. And so the important thing to understand here is that, when humanity was first becoming self-aware, it started developing that ego. And what does that mean? It developed a self-reference. It's like looking in a mirror. Looking in a mirror is meta in a certain way. You're seeing you. You're having a self-reference. And basically how this works is that we all have a sort of what you might call the selector function. We're all mathematical entities, and so we have a selector function, and that out of given set of options, we will pick one option over another. And in the beginning, before we're conscious, that selector function is controlled unconsciously by archetypal forces. When we become conscious, the selector function gains the ability to select for itself. So essentially what this means is that the selector function becomes aware of itself as a selector function unconsciously. It of course doesn't know that it actually is a selector function, except right now in Hyperionism. Do you see how we're literally evolving to a higher level right now by becoming aware of ourselves as a selector function, understanding that we're a selector function? This is, by understanding this, you are engaging in a higher order of thinking. But anyway, in a not defined way, the selector function becomes aware of itself. That's development of the ego, and then the selector function can start to make conscious choices rather than being controlled by archetypal forces and whatnot. So consciousness involves self-reference. That's what happens, right? Consciousness involves self-reference. And so, to gain higher and higher levels of consciousness, we want to engage in higher and higher levels of metacognition. And that means higher and higher levels of self-reference and thinking about thought. And so you need a couple different things here, okay? So in order to reach a new level of consciousness, the highest levels of consciousness, you have to understand what reason is, and you have to have your internal framework of how you view reality actually match objective reality as it is in itself. And then you need to develop your levels of metacognition. Now, these all kind of go hand in hand. These all kind of go hand in hand. In reality, these are all forms of metacognition, because reason is the structure of reality. And so when you engage in metacognition, thinking about thinking, you're employing reason. This is why conscious reasoning starts to develop in humanity when they become conscious, when they become self-aware. Conscious reasoning starts to appear. So conscious reasoning is incredibly important for attaining a higher level of consciousness. So you have to be rational, understand what reason is. You have to have your inner subjective interpretation of reality match objective reality, meaning the world is a certain way in how it's structured. There is truth, and you have to make sure that your interpretation, your mental model of reality, matches what reality is. Right? You have a lot of people who, with their mental models of reality, don't match reality at all. You know, people who think that there's a guy in the sky watching over them, their mental model of reality, their reality tunnel, their Hegelian concept does not match objective reality, noumenal reality, reality in itself. So, and then of course you have to have metacognition, which is thinking about thinking. And there are higher orders of metacognition, but really it encapsulates all that, because understanding the structure of reality, that's going to require the absolute perspective, which is an extreme high level of metacognition. So there are different ways of developing your metacognition in different levels. And to understand this, right, so first humanity becomes self-aware, and that's a very early form of self-reference. It's not thinking about thinking, but it involves self-reference. Now, guess what? Mainstream religion is anti-metacognition. Now, the reason why it's anti-metacognition is because when humanity was first starting to become conscious, it was frightening. When you first become conscious, when you have options in front of you, option A, option B, or option C, and you're conscious, like, oh, wow, which one do I choose? Which one's the right one? Is it A, or is it B, or is it C? I don't know. See, when consciousness comes into the picture, that's frightening for a lot of individuals. Which one do I choose? Which one's the right choice? When humanity wasn't conscious, it didn't have this dilemma. It just chose instinctually. Hungry, eat. Now, that it's conscious, it has choices, and this accompanies, fear and uncertainty and anxiety. Oh no, which one's the right choice? So what humanity did was they started appealing to gods, stories. They started divinatory systems, like casting lots or looking at the entrails of animals, right? They want to make a choice. Oh man, which one do I choose? Well, let's pray to God. Let's see what God tells me which one to do. Oh, let me cast these stones and see what pattern the stones land in, and that will tell me which choice. Let me consult the stars. The stars will tell me what to choose. Be careful with astrology. You see, when you are starting to appeal to something else, you're losing self-reference. And it's a fear of consciousness, and it's a fear of being a self-aware entity, a self-aware being. And you want something else to make that decision for you and tell you what is right. But you are giving up your self-consciousness. And so mainstream religion is anti-metacognition, it's anti-consciousness. So in Hyperionism, we want to maximize metacognition and maximize consciousness. And this is where we bring in not just thinking, but thinking about thinking. And this is why understanding the mathematical nature of reality and the principle of sufficient reason and all of our philosophical concepts are extremely important, because now you're thinking about thinking. Now, also, when higher metacognition begins to develop, it can also gain new abilities. For example, the ability to edit itself. So not only can it select for itself and become aware of itself and think about itself, but when it starts to reach a higher level, it can then edit itself. It can change itself. It can transform itself. And this is where when we talk about interstar actualization and Jungian individuation and making the unconscious conscious. You know, when we talk about the shadow self and the mirror self and the power self. Because now you're engaging in metacognition where you are selecting for yourself, and then you are diving into but now you're altering yourself as well. So you become aware of yourself and then transform yourself through making the unconscious conscious and integration and individuation. Integrating your shadow self, integrating your mirror self, integrating your power self, working on yourself, transforming yourself. See, now you have a self-referential ability, not only for self-referencing, but now self-editing and self-transforming. And that's a higher stage of metacognition. So now you see, as you start to go up the scale, you gain more abilities. Because remember, when humans were just conscious, when humans were unconscious or bicameral, they didn't make conscious choices for themselves. They just did whatever the instincts or archetypes guided them to do. But when they had self-reference, they gained a new ability. Now they could make conscious reasoning. And then you begin to level up, and then not only can you you can make conscious choices. You can make conscious choices. And then as you level up, not only that, well, then you can start to think about thinking, the structure of thought itself. Hardly anyone does that, by the way. Mostly only philosophers do that. Primarily, only philosophers think about thinking, the structure of thought. Not individual thoughts, but the universal structure of thought itself. How does that work? What is thought? And then you can level up as well and begin in not only self-referential abilities, but now self-editing, self-transforming, where you can begin to consciously individuate yourself, shadow self, mirror self, power self, begin to actualize your higher self as well. And so now we have self-awareness that has the ability to modify itself. Now, what happens is, what I want to talk about now is the Hyperion triad, and what this has to do with metacognition and self-reference, and why the Hyperion triad is key to developing the selector function so that it can evolve to select for higher aspects of itself and result in a higher order structure of your consciousness, your evolution. Now that we understand consciousness, and now that we have an understanding of metacognition, let's bring Hyperionism into this. And what we can understand is the Hyperion triadic perspective of the avatar, monadic, and absolute perspectives. We can understand this as sort of a guide to reaching higher order levels of metacognition. Remember, I've talked about in the past that this is the key. This is the key to apotheosis, to becoming God, to self-actualization, to evolution. And well, I said metacognition is. Well, they're the same thing. So this is the key. So in the Hyperion triadic perspective, which is you always try. This is, I can't stress enough how important this is. So the perspectives, for those who aren't familiar, is the avatar, the monadic, and the absolute. Now these are all different degrees of self-reference and engaging in metacognition. So again, the avatar perspective is just the perspective of you as a body, as an avatar, and everyone else in the world, well, most people anyway, are just locked into the avatar perspective. That's all they have. They just think they're a body and that's it. But then you go up a level to the monadic perspective and you understand that no, you're actually an eternal monadic mind. That you're not just a body. That you are an eternal mathematical mind, a monad. And you see now you have a higher level of self-reference. You're not just selecting for this idea of yourself as only a body or only an avatar, but now you're understanding that you are an eternal monadic mind. And then you go to the absolute perspective, which is now selecting for the absolute self, which is all of us together. Abraxas, the absolute, the collective, as the many monadic minds that form the one absolute mind. So having these three different perspectives and being able to understand them is engaging in higher levels of metacognition. But remember that we said that metacognition is thinking about thinking. And this is very important. This is why I stress that it's not just enough to have an intuitive or pictorial or Vorstellung picture thinking mythos way of understanding this, but to understand it rationally, to understand it explicitly, to understand its structure. Because remember, metacognition is thinking about thinking. So you don't want to just, be like, oh yeah, we're, just saying, oh yeah, we're all one, we're the absolute. That's not understanding it explicitly, rationally. You have to not understand it just with pictures and stories, but the structure of thought itself. So when you start engaging in metacognition and understanding rationally what an avatar is, what a monad is, what the absolute is, and that it is you and us, then this is when apotheosis truly begins to occur explicitly. And remember, I said that you have to, for leveling up, right, to gaining the highest levels of consciousness, you need reason, you need your subjective interpretation of reality to max objective reality, and you need metacognition. Well, these are all encapsulated in the same thing. Because you have the triadic perspective. And yes, so you need the understanding of you as an avatar, you as a monad, and you as the absolute. And if you understand this through stories and pictures and metaphors at first, that's fine. But to truly understand it explicitly, you require reason for thinking about thought, the structure of thought itself. And then so you have reason encapsulated within the triadic perspective, within metacognition. And then for having your subjective interpretation of reality match actual reality, well, that will follow when you understand the absolute perspective, because the absolute is everything, and so it incorporates within it the structure of reality. Because the physical universe is just the dream of the absolute. So as you understand rationally the structure of the absolute, you're understanding the structure of objective reality. Thus, your internal interpretation, your model, your reality tunnel, your Hegelian concept will update itself and match external reality because you have understood the absolute perspective. So do you see how understanding yourself ultimately will turn around and invert itself into understanding what's out there. And do you see how reality is like this very, very interesting and intriguing feedback loop? Where if you go deep enough to understand rationally what you are, you'll understand what everything is. That's why it said, know the universe and you will know thyself and you will know the universe and the gods. Know thyself and you will know the universe and the gods. Because when you go deep enough and rationally understand what you are, you'll understand what we are as the absolute. And then that necessarily entails understanding all of objective reality. Because objective reality is an inner aspect of the absolute. And therefore, as you fall into yourself and rationally understand yourself, you'll come out the other end and understand all reality, and that in turn will update your internal model of existence. So, if you're new, that might be a little bit of a mouthful, but you should definitely check out my videos and the videos on the Hyperion source as well for understanding these concepts. But this is the important thing to understand here. So, we have learned what consciousness is, how it differs from sentience and the unconscious. Then we understood metacognition and how self-awareness begins to develop and how thinking about thought is very important. And then finally, we have this idea of the Hyperion triadic perspective, which I always stress is incredibly important. It's the key. Because when you understand the avatar, the monadic, and the absolute perspective, this is giving you the tools and the roadmap to begin higher levels of metacognition and develop higher order structures of consciousness. Right? This is the map, you guys. This is the map for developing a higher order level of consciousness. It is evolution. All right. You want to know how to evolve? This is how you do it. This is how you do it. While the rest of humanity lingers in a very banal and basic self-awareness and stagnant self-awareness, step with us into the future. Become hyper-aware. Understand the triadic perspective, the monadic, the avatar, and the absolute perspective. And begin to rationally understand. If you have to metaphorically understand them at first, that's fine. But eventually, at least begin to understand them rationally as well. Develop these methods of metacognition. And then, of course, interstar actualization and making the unconscious conscious. This is all a part of the process as well. But you see how we have these self-reference is incredibly important. And if you ever are confused, what do you mean by self? Just go to that idea about taking a picture of a photographer taking a photo or painting a painting of someone painting a painting. Self-reference is, it starts to, like a mirror. Oh, I am an I. And then it starts to develop even further, and you start thinking about thought itself. Not only I am an I, but what is an I, right? Just first, I am an I. That is recognized. Then, what is an I? Do you see the difference here? See, now you're really starting to engage in a high level of metacognition when you're thinking about thought. Thinking, oh, I'm hungry, I'm going to go to the store right now. That's not thinking about thought. Thinking, what is an I? Now you're beginning to engage in thinking about thought. When you start thinking about your own reality tunnel, when you start thinking, how do I perceive reality? How do I, when you start to be self-critical and self-reflective, when you start thinking, am I really thinking for myself, or am I following a certain program that has been installed in me? Does this make logical sense? And am I believing it because it is in accordance with the laws of thought? Or am I just believing it because someone yelled it really loud, or because the masses believe it, or because an authority figure told it to me, or a professor said it was true? So you see how you're engaging in thinking about thought now. Self-referential, self-critical thinking about thought. And again, if this sounds simple, it's not. Hardly anyone does this. Only, the best philosophers. Only the best philosophers do this. Hardly anybody does this. And I mean really doing it, not just like ripping a bong hit and going, wow, I'm an I. I mean, that's not... That's not terrible. That's a start, right? Like, that's a start. That's great. And I'm not knocking anyone who does that. But I'm just saying that doing that for 5 minutes, I mean, yeah, it is a, you know, it's a start, it's something. But I'm talking about really getting deep into it and starting engaging in high levels of metacognition, high levels of thinking about that. And then you can, you know, again, then begin self-transformation, self-editing through the process of individuation, inner star actualization, making the unconscious conscious, your shadow self, power self, mirror self, all these things, unlocking your higher self. And then, you know, again, the triadic perspective is so important. Understanding yourself as an avatar, going beyond that and being able to select for not just your avatar, but being able to select for your monadic I as an understanding that you are an eternal mind, an eternal monad, an eternal soul, and then being able to select for the absolute self as well. And so always keep this in mind. This is a very important video, so watch it a few times if you have to. I may make another video on this in the future as well, because this is such an incredibly important topic. But check it out. Make sure you understand the concept of consciousness, how it differs from sentience, how it differs from the unconscious. Then understand metacognition and self-reference, and then see how the Hyperion triadic perspective is sort of this map for maximizing your ability for self-reference. And then once you get to the highest level of self-reference, it references all. Because the highest level of self-awareness is us as the absolute, as Abraxas, as the universe. That's the incredible thing about this, guys. The highest level of self-reference becomes everything that there is. Because everything is us. And that, my friends, is apotheosis. That, my friends, is the opening of the great eye.